Exposure of violent video games to children has negative impacts, and his secondary claims were children behave more aggressively because of exposure to video games, and children can develop an unhealthy addiction. My opponent makes a valid argument about how video games lead to aggressive behavior in children, but then again we can question that because as stated in, oh wait, I got the wrong one. You didn't give me the right one. That's a peer evaluation.
Why did I get a peer evaluation?
You told me to give it to you.
I wouldn't have had you give it to me at this point. Okay.
Also looking out.
I don't have anything else. Let me see. This is what you gave me. Wait, here we go. Oh, I see why that happened. Okay.
Now, I don't even know where to start now. Okay. All right. My opponent, Charles Reyes, main claim states that exposure to violent video games to children have a negative impact on them. His secondary claims is children behave more aggressively because of exposure to video games, and children can develop an unhealthy addiction. And then my counterclaims are do children? Oh wait, no. I found many studies that were inconclusive to the studies that he has found, that saying that how would you? Oh man. Can I start over?
Yeah.
Okay. My counterclaim is that was the children already aggressive to begin with, and what class of the children is he talking about, and where were all the studies that, what studies of children in certain groups was he talking about? All right. Although my opponent makes a valid, argument that, maybe, video games can have a negative effect on children, I feel that there are many other factors that have been accounted for that have not been mentioned. Some classes of people can't afford video games, like minorities. 60% of prison population are minorities, as stated as with Charles Mantoledo in his online article. And in that article he speaks about if those minorities who couldn't afford video games, did those video games teach them how to kill anyway, as the video game suggests? I bring up the prison population because video game Voters Network states that video game populator has tremendously increased over time, and child violence has gone down drastically. Also stated in the network is in order to play a violent game, you need to have violent qualities to begin with. I do agree with my opponent on the fact that maybe the child can adhere to an unhealthy addiction to the video game and act aggressively in that manner. But again, it's not really clear if the video game to begin with is giving them that aggressive behavior. And another thing is that maybe where are the parents in all of this? Not all parents are going to buy video games for their kids for these reasons. So I find it hard to believe that with this argument there are no parents mentioned. In Duke Ferris's online article, he states that blaming violent media is like going to an opera, noticing that most people there are rich, and then concluding that going to an opera makes you rich. I agree with Ferris on this statement because he provides the evidence and charts that that show that as video game popularity increased, the child violence decreased, and I can't really, after seeing that evidence, although I have not found any other charts besides that, I find it hard to believe that that negativity is that substantial that children are going to go out there and act violently because of video games. In conclusion, when given the evidence, I believe that children violence influenced by video games is not valid. The argument that video games do not influence children to violate things is a valid point to make. The evidence for the argument is inconclusive. For lack of evidence and inconclusive studies, I have been led to believe that video game violence has no effect in the violent crimes involving children.
Yeah, you start out by labeling the advocate's claims and secondary claims, which is fine, and then you kind of give us a preview of what your claims are going to be. So now we've got two structures that we're dealing with instead of applying your arguments to the structure that the advocate's presenting. That's going to be a little confusing. It sounds at the very beginning like you're just going to accept some of the conclusions or the premises that the advocate came up with instead of challenging them. Maybe the attitudes of players would be affected in some way. But then later on, you go back to this statistic a couple of times that juvenile delinquency and crime is down, video game numbers are up. We should get a source citation on that. I don't think that that's too hard to come up with. So it does sound like you are challenging at least the one relationship. There's not much analysis of the advocate's evidence or reasoning on these points. There's just this general kind of response about the issue, as evidenced by that one quote that you have where somebody's making an analogy that's challenging the causality of the argument, and they use that opera example. Well, it's an interesting point to raise, but it doesn't necessarily show that the advocate has committed this mistake. It's just as a general conclusion. If the advocate had particular evidence and studies that showed the impact on people who played the video games, and the research is done in a psychological context, they're not making the inference that you're talking about. Instead, they're making a valid conclusion, but you don't challenge any of that information directly, and I think that's a little problematic. All right, thank you.